Alpine Liquid Fertilizers is your full season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. Visit alpinepfl.com for more.
Real Agriculture presents Frontlines, geopolitics affecting agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney. Shaun Haney of Real Agriculture and Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments here for another episode of Frontlines. Hey, Jacob, how you doing?
I'm good, Shaun. It's it's been a really hectic couple of weeks here. I'm sure you can relate.
Yeah, nothing going on geopolitically at all around here. This is
No, it's not like I have clients banging down my door trying to talk about everything from Chinese AI to U.S.-Colombia relations. It's a real mixed bag.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, you know what? Last time we chatted in the fall, I had pressed you on the fact that earlier in 2024, you had said one of the most consequential geopolitical events of 2024 for the year would be the U.S. election. Last time we chatted, you had said, yeah, maybe I correct myself on that. Where do you sit today on it?
Well, if you'll forgive a pedantic response at first, I want to say that I don't know if you've read Foxes and Hedgehogs and Philip Tetlock, but he talks about how there are these different types of analytical personalities. There are foxes and there are hedgehogs. The hedgehog knows one thing really, really well and gives you the same thing over and over and over again every single time. Foxes flit around. They change their minds. They're intellectual dilettantes. What was once true is no longer true. And maybe this, maybe that. And the ironic thing is that media rewards the hedgehogs because even though they're wrong statistically more of the time, they're more persuasive. They're more compelling because they're making a simpler point and it's one that lands. I am a fox, so you're going to hear ambivalence coming from me because I'm going to recorrect myself and say I was actually right the first time. But I want to tell you how I was wrong. The reason I was wrong to think that it wasn't going to be such a big was because I misapplied a framework to what Trump was going to do. I thought Trump was going to govern in an isolationist style. And when I was giving presentations on the road or when I was talking on my own podcast, I was invoking George Washington and the history of isolationism in U.S. foreign policy and how Trump was the latest chapter in this. I had the wrong policy framework because it's clear to me now he's not an isolationist at all. He's an imperialist. And he's talking that way. He's even invoking the president who I would compare him the most to right now, which is William McKinley. I don't know if you've noticed in some of these press conferences, he goes rambling off about William McKinley. Who was William McKinley? President of the United States from 1898 to 1900 before he was assassinated. Everybody remembers his vice president who took over, Teddy Roosevelt, but it was William McKinley who started that administration. He wins the Spanish-American War, so the U.S. takes over parts of the Philippines and Puerto Rico and casts its eye on Central America and South America. He raises tariffs and all sorts of protectionist measures against all sorts of countries in the world. And he's also the contra indicator to William Jennings Bryan and don't, on a cross of gold, that whole speech thing. McKinley's the opposite of all that. And this is the man that Trump has been invoking. And I think it's a really compelling comparison because what has Trump done in between when he was president-elect and now in his first week and a half of office? Oh, Greenland has resources. I would like them. The Panama Canal is important to the United States. I would like that too. Oh, Colombia, you didn't listen to me. Bam, emergency tariffs. I'm going to take you. Everybody's on notice. That's imperialism. It's naked imperialism. And it's not outside the bounds of U.S. foreign policy. I don't say that with any sort of pejorative intent. I'm just saying the foreign policy framework he's applying is that imperialist late 1800s, early 1900s U.S. foreign policy. And that is hugely consequential because the United States has not governed from that position since the end of World War II. It's a real about face and a real change. So what I thought was he was leaning towards isolationism. I think not. I think he's actually leaning towards imperialism, and that has massive implications.
How much? What do you make of? Do you think there is like a potential reality of taking back the Panama Canal, acquiring Greenland from Denmark? And of course, our audience is very interested in what do you make of the 51st state comments that he continues to double down on?
He does continue to double down on them. There's a lot to break apart there. And I think the biggest question, if the election was the biggest sort of question or event last year, the biggest question for the next 2 years is going to be very simply, does Donald Trump believe all the things that he's saying? Or is this all a bluff? Is this all about negotiating better deals with both adversaries and U.S. allies? Because if he really believes what he's talking about and he doubles down when it comes listen to him, that's a very different sort of decision tree and a matrix of what happens afterwards if it's just all about a deal. If I was advising the government of Panama, I would take it deadly seriously. I don't think he's joking at all. And there's plenty of U.S. history to suggest the United States could intervene here if it wanted to. The United States military was on the ground in Panama in the 1970s. The United States was involved in the construction of the canal. It is literally critical to the operations, not just of the U.S. economy, but the U.S. Navy to be able to transit back and forth. And if you want to lever against China or some of these other countries, like, yes, it's a big deal. It's a reason Secretary of State Rubio's first visit will be to Panama. So are they going to take over the canal? Are they going to conquer Panama? No. But are they trying to reset what the U.S. relationship is with the canal or with management of the canal, or maybe trying to, restrict access to the canal to other powers? Absolutely. I would take that seriously. Greenland, I think, is a little bit more of a joke. I don't think that he actually means that. That is also part of a negotiation because he wants Greenland's resources. I don't think that he's going to go conquer Greenland. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not critical to U.S. Foreign policy interests. As for Canada, this is where the rubber really meets the road with that question. Is he bluffing, or does he really believe it? Does he really want to annex Canada, or does he want a better trade deal with Canada? I think part of the question here also is, was all of are his comments about Canada really driven at Trudeau? We've seen that Trump gets very personal with global leaders that he doesn't like. Think about his relationship with Angela Merkel in a negative sense, or with AMLO in Mexico as a positive sense. Maybe he sniffed out weakness in Trudeau, and maybe he knew that if he just elbowed him out a little bit, he could lead to the downfall of the Trudeau government, which he has done, and he'll get a conservative politician leading Canada that he'll be able to work with better. And then maybe he'll start renegotiating, deals and doing things better. The flip side of that is that Canada has no leverage here. What is Canada's top export to the United States? It's oil. What does the Trump administration promise to do? Surge U.S. oil production. The U.S. can't treat Mexico the same way because it needs Mexico's help on migration and fentanyl, on counterfeit Chinese products, and on cheap for all the manufacturing that it wants. Nearshoring. Canada has none of that to offer, and it is currently at least led by a prime minister that Trump absolutely detests. So I think, Shaun, that it's part of a negotiation, and once you get a new prime minister, that Trump will still start saying crazy things, but that it's all part of the U.S., Mexico, Canada free trade negotiation, and that Trump is just looking for leverage and trying to exact concessions. But I also cannot dismiss the scenario that he actually believes this stuff and will double down on it. And if he does that, I mean, the implications are massive.
What's the proof that he? So I hear this a lot, that he detests Trudeau and like they don't get along. Where's the evidence of that? If that was the case, why have him down to Mar-a-Lago? Why have I gave a presentation yesterday in Nova Scotia showing the photo of the two of them at that table, smiling and having a great time. And what makes us think that he's going to like the next guy, Pierre Poilievre, who he potentially, although both conservative, they really don't have a lot in common whatsoever. So where's this come from that him and Trudeau don't get along?
He might very well like whoever the success. Maybe we'll be dealing with this a little bit down the road. I think with Trudeau in particular, though, Trudeau, to his own negative consequence, anointed himself a leader of the woke crowd and a standard bearer of globalization and all of these things that Trump stands against. And I think that Trump felt like Trudeau, like the Obamas, looked down on him and thought he was unsophisticated and thought he was dirty and uncouth and all these things. And I think that Trump took all that personally, to the extent that why did he have him down at Mar-a-Lago and smile? Probably to lord over him, probably to let him know that he was the one who had the leverage there. But now we're getting into psychoanalysis. The deeper question really is, like I said, is Trump going to use all of these crazy comments to renegotiate a deal with Canada around U.S., Mexico, Canada free trade agreement? Or is he really serious? Is he really willing to blow up all of the supply chains that link the United States and Canada because he thinks that Canada has to bend the knee? Because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll stand up for Canada here as a little bit, even though I'm the American on the call. I don't think Canada is going to consent to becoming the 51st state. I think Canada will say, no, thank you, Mr. Trump. We will find other options, even if it is painful in the short term. That's the best answer I have for it.
Yeah, well, I think you've analyzed that very, very correctly. I think that is Canada's response indeed. What I found interesting is that in Trump 1.0, there was a lot of talk about NAFTA, bad deal, terrible deal, like we need to get a different deal. Okay, that's saleable. It had been in place for a long time and hadn't really been updated to the extent that probably a lot of, all three countries would
Hmm.
want over the course of time. The deal we're talking about now is the deal that he negotiated and actually gave it a new name, the USMCA. In Canada, they call it CUSMA. In Mexico, they call it something else. Everybody had to take, give one of the naming rights to it. But this is the deal that he negotiated. I'm curious as to, do you know why that aspect or that fact is not being talked about a lot? Well, if this is such a bad deal and Canada's taking advantage of us, was it you that negotiated the bad deal in the first place?
Well, first of all, Trump has a very loose relationship with the truth. So everything is about sentiment. I don't. One of the best examples of this, I don't know if you saw this. University of Michigan had a poll that showed Democrats' expectations of inflation versus Republican expectations of inflation. Republicans, up until the election, were expecting much higher than average inflation. And then, as soon as the election happened, it dropped. Now they're expecting sub 1%. So, in
Right.
some sense, and this is Trump's great genius, he has his finger on the pulse of what people think, which has nothing to do with reality, Sean. It has to do with what
Yeah.
people think and feel on the inside, and he's able to push the buttons there. But the answer to your question is that the renegotiation did not go very well for the United States. And it didn't go very well for the United States because all of Trump's deal making and things like that didn't actually work in the working groups and the negotiating sessions and all the nitty gritty details that had to be done to push these agreements out. And Trump wasn't very good at navigating the system. He didn't have appointees in place. He didn't have his best negotiators in place to go toe to toe with the Canadian negotiators and the Mexican negotiators. So if you're the U.S. and you walk away from the renegotiation and you see, actually, Mexico and Canada probably made out better than we did here. So Trump has to renegotiate a deal, make everyone forget that the bad deal happened under his watch, and then slap a new Trump brand onto this one and say, this is really the Trump deal. And this is one of the interesting things for me from the past week. I think one of the challenges with Trump is going to be separating signal from noise.
Yeah,
There was a
yeah.
lot of noise this week on the U.S.-Colombia relationship. We can get into the melodrama if you want. It's a really fun story. The signal for me was Trump went on social media, threatened the tariffs, everything else. And he wasn't by himself. There was immediate responses from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Secretary of State, the U.S. Commerce Department. They were all lining up to do exactly the things that he said on social media. In Trump 1.0, Trump would go off the handle on social media, and it would be, well, who's supposed to put that in place, and where do we go, and we have to do an investigation. This, that. That wasn't true with the U.S. Colombia. It went away. It was a tempest in a teacup. But the United States government was ready, and they were ready to through on some of Trump's threats. So maybe he learned the first time around, and maybe he's going to stock the positions that he needs to actually extract the concessions with his top-down deal-making, narrative structuring, all the things that he's really good at. That's the hunch I'm working on.
Yeah, the Colombian leader pushed back in his own tweets or posts on X, but then immediately withdrew his position, I guess, and backed down and basically gave in to everything that Trump wanted, including the military planes delivering the illegals back to Colombia.
Well, that's the narrative that the Trump supporters want you to have, and it's a
Okay.
narrative that is true. The narrative that the Colombian side would want you to have as well. We said we would take them, and all we said was that it had to be with a modicum of dignity and respect towards these migrants. You had to treat them like human beings. And so, after this kerfuffle between Petro and Trump, and by the way, if you haven't seen the Petro comments, go and look them up.
Yeah,
He went crazy
he
at Trump,
did.
called him a white enslaver, and all these other things. Just as like, if you're a sporting man watching sort of people insult each other, I was like, that's very impressive, Mr. Petro. Well done. But yeah, I mean, like he basically just the Colombians came out and said, okay, we got them to agree that they have to treat these people with dignity and respect, and we'll send the presidential plane, or we'll do whatever we need to do to ensure that the dignity and respect is there. So we reached an agreement, and we're fine. So both sides can sort of claim that they got what they wanted out of the deal. It reminded me, I mean, for me, this is a basketball metaphor, but for most of your listeners, I guess it's a hockey metaphor, where it was one of those hold me back fights where you're on the hockey rink and they pretend like they want to fight with each other,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
like
yeah,
really
yeah.
the friend is like, hold me back, like
Let
I'm going
me
to get him.
let me
I'm
at him.
really
Let
gonna
me
get
at
him.
him.
I think both the sides were doing that. So it was a bunch of nonsense. And it's why I say the signal, though, was the threat and then the U.S. government follow through. Like
Yeah.
that was different. I sat up in my chair a little bit when like DHS and the secretaries, all these people are on board. This is not just Trump flying off the handle. This seems to have been premeditated. The other signal that got lost in all this, by the way, everybody's focusing on the U.S. and Colombia, and rightfully so, but Honduras came out over the weekend and said, yeah, we've been talking to the Trump administration. We don't really like what we're hearing. We're going to start looking towards China or other places because we're not going to be talked to this way. I'm paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
pretty liberally. But, there was no talk of, well, Honduras, sort of pushing back against the United States, and Trump didn't go after them. He went after Colombia because I think he knew he had maximum leverage. And this is one place where maybe Canadians should have some sympathy for the Colombians, because you know what Colombia's top export to the United States is? Also oil. So if you're going to mess with the United States, but they don't need the top product that you export to them, well, apparently Trump's going to make an example of you because he knows that he's standing on firmer ground, whereas he can't with some of these other countries that he's more dependent on.
Yeah, I think Canada needs to start talking more about potash.
Yes, that's a big one. Or
that's
agricultural machinery, or there's a bunch of ones that you can throw on the fire. But yeah.
Yeah. Fast forwarding ahead, one thing that I've been sort of curiously pondering in this deportation saga is, I think it's easier to understand how Colombia would receive Colombians back, right? That had illegally crossed the U.S., or Mexico receiving Mexican illegals that had illegally crossed. Where rubber may hit the road here, and this may get a little bit ugly, is where potentially, we get down to like maybe what I would call the odds and ends of however many people are going to be deported, where it's, oh, by the way, Colombia, here's, 5 plane loads of people from China, India, Eastern Europe, and a few other people from Latin America sprinkled in. You need to take them, or 25% tariffs. Could that be a likely scenario we see?
Yeah, or just, hey, here's a bunch of Venezuelans, or here's a bunch of Cubans, or here's a bunch of El Salvadorans. I think that's possible, but I will say I'm a little bit encouraged by Secretary of State Rubio. So I already alluded to his first visit as Secretary of State is going to be to Panama. He's going to go from there to the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, a couple other countries in Central America. A lot of U.S. administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have paid lip service to better relations with these countries. Secretary of State Rubio, who comes from a Latin American background, might be the first to actually put his money where his mouth is. And maybe this is one area where he's going to be able to actually build relations with some of these countries and work out relationships so that exactly what you're describing doesn't happen. But yes, if the United States decides that it wants to behave like an imperialist country and just drop migrants wherever and not worry about it, yeah, you could imagine that Trump would threaten tariffs and try to cajole any of the countries that don't accept them. For all I know, he thinks he's going to export them to the Gaza Strip after he pushes out all the Palestinians, which was another crazy thing that he said last week about, just depopulating the Gaza Strip. So it's all over the place. But yes, again, the other signal there is President Trump is going to use the threat and the implementation of protectionist trade measures to get what the United States wants. And the really interesting question will happen, well, what happens when a country like Colombia says, no, we're not doing that?
Right.
Is he going to follow through, or is he going to be like, okay, I didn't mean it, or okay, well, how about you meet me halfway? We need to make a deal here. Is he the deal maker, or is he so blinded by his own rage about the things that he didn't achieve during his first term that he's just going to go after it?
Or hey, Canada, here's a truckload of illegals from Honduras. Like, I said that to an audience yesterday, and everybody kind of laughed. I'm like, why are we laughing? I could totally see that happening. Why would you think that's funny? Because I think it's a reality that we're gonna have to be, talking about and dealing with. There is a lot of news in Canada about, what happens when some of the illegal migrants that don't want to be arrested and deported try to get into Canada. I think there's be a lot of pressure on Canada to capture them and work with U.S. authorities to have them deported. But we'll have to see how all that plays out.
Well, and I just want to say here, like, the amazing thing here is that the superpower of the United States, of Canada, of the UK and Australia is their ability to assimilate immigrants. It is what allows them to deal with the potential negative impacts of slowing population growth. The best and brightest of the world are not fleeing their countries trying to get to China. Like, they're not teach their kids Chinese and grow up in an authoritarian Chinese system because they think their children will have better lives. They're trying to get to the United States. They're trying to get to Canada because there's opportunity there, and because there's the opportunity not just to have a better life, but to integrate into a country with the rule of law where they don't have to worry about, some cartel coming and getting them, or their kids not having jobs and things like that. Immigration should be a geopolitical strength. And the narrative has turned into, no, you should fear these migrants. And I know, I can already hear the rejoinders, but what about the illegal immigrants? Yes, illegal migration is not good. Yes, the United States in particular has needed immigration law reform since the 1980s, and a majority of Americans have told every single poll since the 1980s that that's what they want. No U.S. government has been able to deliver it. But if the United States government could deliver immigration law reform and could keep out the illegals and then also create a system to actually assimilate the good people, the people that
Yeah.
you want to assimilate into your country, well, suddenly all these demographic issues go away. Suddenly we're talking about the economic benefits that come from these things. And none of that is in the conversation at all. And it seems a little strange to me that that part of the conversation is not there because that's the thing that needs to be fixed. And instead it's all fear and illegals
Yeah.
and coming from my jobs, yada, yada.
Right there with you. Like you look at the amount of illegals that are working on farms in the United States, it is significant. I've been at multiple U.S. farm meetings. It is a big concern. We're already short labor. If we don't have access to that labor, where the heck is the labor going to come from? And are we looking at increasing the capacity of something like the H-2A program, which is the legal path for migration for people that are working in agriculture? If you're not going to increase the capacity and the resource capabilities of that, boy, we're burning the candle at both ends here. That's, I think,
Yeah.
a big concern for farm country.
I also, in something you said that the audience laughed when you said that thing about the busload of Honduran immigrants at the border. Part of that laughter is probably just it's an uncomfortable idea. It's a politically incorrect idea. So you sort of laugh to cover over your own discomfort. But I think there's also something else in that laughter, which is that audience probably reflexively knows, well, if he does that and we get into a big tariff war, isn't inflation going to go through the roof? And isn't that going to affect Trump's power in the future? And the answer to that is yes. If he follows through on these things and we get to these scenarios that we're talking about, the inflation prints are going to be wild. And then you're telling Trump is going to sit there with an inflation print and he's just going to keep doing what he's doing. If he does, the Republicans will lose the House and maybe even the Senate by the midterms. And then he'll be a lame duck and he won't be able to do anything. So unlike leaders in authoritarian countries like Putin or like Xi Jinping, Trump has a feedback mechanism. If some of the things that he does don't start leading to falling prices, which is another thing that he promised, that's a much more difficult thing to cover up than the US, Mexico, Canada free trade agreement, all the complexities of that. Once it gets into, oh, prices are going up, even though you said prices were getting better. We just saw what happened to Joe Biden on that. It will happen to Donald Trump too if he can't figure that out. And doubling down on what you just talked about, if we're in that world, probably inflation is going through the roof. Just labor inflation by itself would probably be going through the roof if we're getting to the scenario where the United States is dumping Hondurans at the Canadian border.
I just finished Bob Woodward's book, War, but talks about the end of the Biden presidency and Trump's quest to take back the White House. What is some really interesting stuff there about President Biden? Not giving a real vote of confidence from Woodward as you hear some of the stories. What is Biden's legacy at this point? Just shortly after him leaving the White House, and legacies can change over time. George W. Bush's did, I think. What's Biden's legacy right now?
I think you're right to say it's too early to tell. I think of Biden as a tragic figure, somebody who yearned and longed for the office for most of his entire career and only achieved it when he was beyond his physical and mental prime. And I think he had a lot of things that he wanted to do that were good. He also had some things that maybe he was forced into doing based on political constraints or constraints in his own party. But if you just look sort of pound for pound in terms of what kind of legislation did he get done, what kinds of things from his record did he push through, his record will actually probably be pretty good. And he actually did manage some of these situations very well. Now, some of the things will look like a stain on his record, like the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way that was handled. He will always wear that with a badge of shame. But he should also get credit for basically single-handedly repairing the South Korea-Japan relationship. He's also the first one to really get the United States out of the Middle East. He didn't do it particularly well, but Obama promised to do that. Trump promised to do that. It was Joe Biden who got the United States out of the Middle East, no matter what the consequences were there. So I think it's a mixed legacy. I think him sticking around, not having the self-awareness to know that he couldn't handle a second term was bad. But a lot of his legacy will be written by what happens with inflation during the Trump administration. If inflation goes sky high, people might look back at Biden and say, boy, he was really keeping a handle on those prices, wasn't he? In retrospect, things were pretty good back then. Whereas if Trump can grow the economy and do all the things that he's promised to do, then maybe Biden sort of looks like a sore thumb. So too early to talk about his legacy. But for me, the only thing I know for certain is that I think history will look back at him sort of like a tragic figure, not unlike Jimmy Carter, somebody who was wrong place, wrong time, didn't have the policies to meet the challenges that were ahead of him. Maybe fundamentally a good person at heart, but not up to the task of the things that were in front of him.
Yeah, timing is everything in business and in politics and a lot of life's endeavors.
Well,
in
and I hate the partisanship around it too. Like I hope it is uncontroversial to just say I admire Joe Biden in the very narrow sense of this man was a public servant for most of his adult life. And yes, he was ambitious, and yes, he wanted power, and yes, he did all sorts of things that I would have, disagreed with from a political. But how many people do you know their lives to public service their adult life? Not that many. And for that, he should be getting thanks and should be getting lionized. There are fewer people who devote themselves to that kind of service for their entire life.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess things to look out forward on. What should we be watching? Is it, will the US or will they not apply these broad sweeping tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China? I like how Canada and Mexico are lumped in with China, which is a totally different actor. And I keep on telling audiences that that should be one of the most concerning things from a Canadian perspective is we're being lumped in with China in that triangle, which is a bit of a message in itself.
Yeah, this was actually I have been saying just for a couple of months now, or presentations for a couple of months ago, because this was a secret. If you looked at Project 2025 or the Heritage Project, the Heritage Foundation's transition project, China and Canada and Mexico and Vietnam, South Korea, all these countries were in the same bucket with a trade deficit and all the problems that the U.S. was going to have with them. So that's not any sort of huge surprise to me. But I think you've hit on it. So number one, the first thing that Trump promised to do when he came to office was 60% tariffs across the board against China. What did he do instead? An investigation into whether China satisfied its phase one China trade deal requirements. You don't need an investigation for that. Maybe we should get the Department of Government Efficiency on this. They didn't meet their requirements. So that's telling you that he's buying time. So the moment, he also a couple of days later threatened to actually put the tariffs on China, but at least his first salvo was not tariffs. It was, I'm buying time. I'm thinking about positioning. So I'm going to be watching for when and if those tariffs go on China, or is it part of a broader renegotiation? The second thing that I'll be watching really closely is the outcome of the German elections. If German elections yield a strong center-right coalition that is not going to get pushed around by the United States, that will make things very interesting very quickly in a multipolar world, because then the European Union is not going to be a passive actor. It's going to be one that is thinking about and balancing between China and the United States and putting its foot on the scale of the Russia-Ukraine war. It can't be France. Macron's election gambit blew up in his face, so he's completely handicapped at home. But if you can get a strong German government, not a foregone conclusion, but the one that we've had so far the last couple of years has been feckless and incompetent. You get a strong German government, that would be a big deal. And then last but not least, yes, I think it's U.S. relations with Mexico and Canada. Is he actually going to follow through on some of these things, or is this all part of a renegotiation of a deal that he's going to make with both sides? I think it's the latter, but that's the thing that we have to watch for, because if it starts going in the direction of the former, buckle up your seatbelts for inflation and interest rates and all sorts of fun things.
Yeah, everybody's not clearly on the same page. We've got talk about, the idea of a 2.5% tariff that escalates to give businesses time to adjust. We've got other people arguing for full scale 25% tariffs across the board, and then we've got other stories. Bloomberg had a story a couple weeks ago where it was going to be precision tariffs, and we're going to be putting just tariffs on strategic things. I know this steel is probably the most likely to have a tariff. If there's no tariff on steel, I think that would be a total jump in a different direction. I'm not sure who knows what the strategy is, and I guess I think just the threat of the significance of these tariffs is having an effect as you talk to manufacturers.
But this is why I think it's all about making a deal and that he's not actually going to follow through, because the United States does not make things anymore. 35% of manufacturing production in the world is China. Another 31% is the rest of the world. The United States is a small percentage of that. The United States does not build its own ships. It doesn't manufacture its own pharmaceutical drugs or even some of its higher level drugs. It doesn't make solar panels. It doesn't build cars by itself. It can't make a semiconductor start to finish. You start to go down the list of the things that the United States can't make, it's most of them, because it's outsourced most of these things. So if you're really going to follow through on this, you're going to blow up supply chains. And unless the United States government is going to contribute trillions of dollars to manufacturing that stuff at home or in markets that are nearby, if you follow through on these things, the prices of things are going to massively increase and the availability of these things are going to go away. So the United States has some leverage here, but the flip side of that is the United States does not make things anymore. And that's how the United States designed it. We get cheap goods from the rest of the world, because they make it for cheaper and not worrying about how the environment is going to work and things like that. And that is the part of this. I have not heard what the plan is from the Trump administration. And you're right. You have internal factions within the Trump administration that are not of a similar mind of this. On the one hand, you've got people like Scott Besson out there saying, well, tariffs are not actually inflationary. What's inflationary is expanding the money supply and blowing out the deficit. You're telling me they're not going to blow out the deficit? You think Trump is going to change his stripes and become a fiscal conservative? Like, what are we talking about here? He's already talking about what he's going to use the customs revenue to do from a government perspective, whether it's Stargate or his shipbuilding or anything else. That's why I say, if he is serious about all these things and if he thinks that he's right, okay, like it's going to be a very different world and it's going to be very bumpy. I think it's got to be about a deal. I don't think that he can actually think he's going to do these things, and that countries like China, Germany, Brazil aren't going to eventually stand up and be like, okay, fine, take your ball home. We'll do things ourselves. See how you like it when inflation prints above 10% in the United States and what that does to your approval ratings.
Hey, Jacob, really appreciate you joining me here today. It's always great to do an episode of Frontlines. We got to make sure we stay on a regular schedule here through 2025. It is always insightful, and really appreciate it.
I'm here for you, and I just to head it off, I try not to be partisan about anything. I have no my political opinions are not in any of this analysis. I'm just trying to state things objectively, and I know that you are too. And it's just harder and harder to do that. Because even when you give that sort of analysis, I know that people come back at you. So I just wanted to make that clear that I'm talking passionately here, but I guarantee you that none of you know who I voted for in the last presidential election.
Really appreciate it. Hey, if you have any feedback, everybody, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected. And we'll talk to you again soon. Cheers.